trained as a cognitive psychologist, but I've been doing a lot of work in education departments and working with children with dyslexia and some intervention work with them. So I have kind of a broad perspective, but just to kind of bring everyone up to speed if you're not familiar with either this area or some of the kind of more cognitive modeling of reading. I'll go through some of that first and talk about the connections between reading and language itself, and then go through some of the traditional models as well as some models that consider the cognition of reading in more than one script or reading across different types of languages, and then finish up with some more recent work that we're doing. We've been working on, but collecting some more data on spelling, children's spelling in different scripts. So we're kind of hot off the presses with some of this. I was working on some of the data yesterday, actually. So it's a little bit preliminary and not sure what exactly to make of all the findings quite yet, but I'm happy to have discussion on some of that as we go through. I can't really see anyone. I don't know if you can see me, but is there any, I guess if there's any questions, if people want to stop, you can just holler at me. Would that work?
Can you hear me now? Yeah, we can all hear you, and we're all here online, and yeah, we will encourage questions at the end and also throughout.
Okay. Okay, then I'll just
I'll leave us unmuted. Thanks.
Okay, sounds good. Okay, so just to start, we know that communicating and understanding, these are some basic human functions, and for the most part, these are undertaken in two modalities typically. Oral language and written language are two modalities that we use for communicating and understanding. Of course, there's other ways to do this, but for today, we're focusing on these two. And these modes also involve shared skills in order to process language. So there's some really interesting work. I'll touch on a little of some neuroscience findings because it's a personal interest of mine. And for this set of studies, some researchers have looked at brain areas that are related to processing semantic meaning. And they've conducted some studies where they had participants both listen to stories and then also read those same stories in print. And what they found when they used MRI and bold signals of activity within these brain regions that are tuned for semantic meaning is that there's high correlation between these areas in the brain when people are either using either modality to understand the stories. So there's a good degree of overlap, or at least in terms of the activity, there's high correlation in the areas that are related for both listening and for reading. And this also is shown across timescales. So in another elegant study, they looked at different timescales that would be involved in like shorter processing of sentences versus longer processing of paragraphs. And they find that it's consistently, you see this relationship for both written and spoken language and how we process it. So this correlation is found also across languages. So there's another study by Ruckel et al., and they've found that there's convergence in the parts of the brain that process just that process both speech and print. So the overlapped areas here are in pink, and they found this again across several different languages. So in this case, we can assume that reading and literacy are in part kind of piggybacking onto these established language areas in the brain where we process language for meaning, for both communicating and understanding. And the importance of language processing is also highlighted in models of reading. So cognitive models, such as the well-known simple view of reading model. Here they emphasize language comprehension, which makes up half of the equation of what's defined as reading comprehension. So reading comprehension is the product of decoding skills plus language comprehension skills. And in this case, you need both since it's multiplicative. If you don't have decoding skills, then you won't understand reading. But also if you don't have language comprehension skills, you also want to understand what you're reading. And so this is also important in models for reading development. So in reading development, it's understood that language knowledge, so background knowledge, vocabulary knowledge, these are all very important for children who are learning to read, right? But there's also an important new process that needs to develop for the child to become an independent reader. And this is specifically related to the processing of print. So these word recognition types of skills down the bottom are new for each child, and each child has to develop these skills through learning, and a lot of times, most times, through explicit instruction. So it's not something that's naturally acquired like language is. So this is where the two skills deviate, right, from each other. So another well-known reading model focuses on these word recognition skills or decoding skills. And this has been an influential model by Coulthart et al., referred to as the dual root model for spoken reading. So this was originally posed to understand the reading of words that are either regularly spelled or irregularly spelled in English. And following this model, it's also been shown that there are multiple neural paths for word reading, which correspond to these theorized dual roots. That is, for regularly spelled words, readers can decode these letter by letter and sound by sound, and then blend them together to read the word out loud. And this is referred to as assembled phonology. And there's been much research and some meta-analyses also of brain processing and neural networks to show that these types of processes are related to a more dorsal pathway in the brain, so involving parietal and frontal areas. And in this case, they refer to this as also a sublexical pathway because you're looking at information beneath the word level, smaller than the word level. The other root in this model is what's referred to as addressed phonology. And this is where the reader would come up with the whole word's phonology rather than parsing it sound by sound. So this involves addressed phonology that links the pattern of letters all together to identify the whole spoken word form. This processing is at the word or lexical level, so sometimes it's then referred to as the lexical pathway, and it's also shown to be associated with a neural path in the ventral areas of the brain involving more temporal lobe areas as well as temporal occipital parts of the brain. Okay, so this is the configuration of the dual root model. And this is one of two prominent theories that I'll discuss, but just to go through again as a reminder, so this is from Castle's and Coulthart's model. And here, when you read a word, again, this is developed for English, so just keeping this in mind. When we read a word, we can go about identifying that word in one of two ways. So the dual roots would involve going from the print to read the word letter by letter, having this grapheme to phoneme conversion system where you map each sound or you map each letter to the sound, and then you blend the sounds together to make the word. This is also referred to as the indirect root or the sublexical root that we just saw. And this can also be used to sound out unknown words or new vocabulary, as well as non-words or pseudo words. And then the other root over here is what we referred to before as the lexical root. So this involves word level processing. So you can take a known spelling of a word, and that will directly access or activate other linked representations of that word in terms of the word's meaning, as well as the overall sound of the whole word, the verbal label of that word. The alternative to the dual root model that's been posed, and there's still some debate back and forth about which of these is a better model to describe the reading process for humans. But the triangle model was a model that was developed from neural networks of reading. So originally from McClellan and Rumelhart and Plout and others. This involves a set of linked or interconnected mental representations. So again, while it's modeled on a computer, it's supposed to be the metaphor for what the brain does. So it suggests that we have different types of mental representations that store information about words, meaning, the semantic store, their print, the orthographic store, and then their sound, the phonological store. And so these neural networks were demonstrated to be able to do what humans do, that is to learn to read without being specifically programmed to read. They could also read both regular words, irregular words, as well as pseudo words, but coming up with a verbal label for the given printed input. And in this way, this group of researchers suggested that we don't really need a dual root model. This one model can kind of do it all. So this debate is somewhat still ongoing. But it is interesting that these two sets of models show similarities despite coming from different paradigms. So the dual root model was coming from behavioral studies of reading and reading errors, as well as reading disorder subtypes, whereas the triangle model was a theory that emanated from AI and computational modeling of the reading process. So we'll refer back to these a little bit, but just to give you some background on what these are. Okay, so again, most of this work, and there's volumes of work on all of these different types of cognitive models and how well they explain human behavior of reading. But most of them have been conducted with English language, and less so with other scripts. Although the triangle model, there are some more recent versions that look at reading like Chinese script, and it's found to be just as good of a fit in terms of its output as reading in English. However, there's been a lot less work in terms of modeling and just understanding what are the properties of reading across different languages. So, is reading the same regardless of what language you read, or are there language specific properties and we have to learn differently when we learn to read in different languages? So next I'll just go through another set of models, and these are models that specifically examine reading across different languages. So the first one is the orthographic depth hypothesis. So this was posed by Katz and Feldman, and what they suggested was that different scripts are more or less consistent in terms of how the print maps onto sound. Okay, and these for the most part are looking at either transparent languages, transparent alphabetic languages like Italian, where the grapheme to phoneme correspondence is pretty much almost 1-to-1. There's no variability. And then you have other alphabetic languages like English, where you have a lot of inconsistencies. Letters can be pronounced different ways and spelled different ways. And then you, of course, have more opaque languages, and this includes non-alphabetic languages where there's even less correspondence between sound and print. And so some of the languages that we're studying here in Singapore and that we'll talk about in our studies on this type of a spectrum kind of spread from the more opaque language of Chinese to more transparent scripts of Tamil and Malay. Another model of reading across different languages goes kind of a step beyond the depth hypothesis to say that depending on how consistent the script is in terms of print to speech mappings, then this will affect the level at which the reader processes the print. So in other words, if there's a language that's very consistent, then it's easy enough for the reader to focus in on letter by letter or phoneme by phoneme decoding. But if it's less consistent, then and the phonological units are not as available in the language, then this drives the reader to a higher level of what they refer to as granularity or grain size. So that means in languages like English, you might find more consistency in how the word is pronounced based on the spelling of the rhyme pattern of the word. And this goes back to some of the original kind of reading development theories about whether whether it's better or whether readers will more naturally or more easily learn to read English by being taught rhymes, like Goswami's work with rhyme pattern learning versus learning phonics. Okay, so then another major model that was proposed with regard to reading across different languages is Perfetti et al.'s lexical constituency model. And here they suggest that with all of these differences between languages, what the readers hone in on are the relevant units of this print to sound to meaning connections. Whatever units make word reading most efficient is what they'll focus in on. And readers will learn to do this when they read their own languages. So for non-alphabetic languages like Chinese, the characters code at a larger grain size of syllables or whole words. Whereas, sorry, there's an airplane flying overhead. Whereas for alphabetic languages, particularly the transparent alphabetic languages, these encode smaller units of speech, either more or less consistently. So the transparent languages would prompt the reader to use the smallest grain size of phonemes, whereas, as mentioned, those who read a more opaque or less shallow or deeper orthography might use a larger grain size that's more effective or efficient or consistent. Okay. So in terms of the triangle model, we can think about these two kinds of, at least in terms of alphabetic scripts, we can think about what's a shallow language versus what's a deep language, and those connections that are more effective for the reader. So in a shallow language, again, we can go from orthography to phonology to the lexical representation rather easily. Whereas in a deeper language, there might be reason to just go directly from the orthographic representation to the lexical representation. Okay, so remember the studies that we talked about with reading and listening to text. The study where they found that there's overlap, and this actually was reading or listening to words, and they used a semantic task where you had to categorize the what type of what category the word that you see or hear belongs to. And so in the slide that I showed you before, they did find that there's a great deal of overlap in terms of both listening and reading words. However, in the same study, they looked at different languages, so they found overlap across languages. But then they also did find some variation within languages. So in this case, the yellow parts of the brain that are highlighted, so this is the left side and this is the right side. The yellow parts were identified as reading network areas. And so when they compared languages that were either more shallow or transparent, like Spanish, to more opaque languages like English, Hebrew, as well as Chinese, what they found was that for the transparent language, there was more activity in the areas that we looked at before, which are related to the dorsal root of reading, whereas for the more opaque languages, there was relatively more activity in the more ventral areas that we talked about before. Okay. And so in a study that we've conducted, colleagues here at Nanyang Technological University, along with some of our colleagues at Johns Hopkins, in one of the studies, we actually observed differences in brain activity for bilinguals here in Singapore who know either two alphabetic scripts, so that would be English and the Tamil script, which is alphabetic, or English plus a non-alphabetic script, so English plus Chinese. So these were young adults. And of interest is for each of the scripts that they know, like for Chinese readers, they know the opaque script of Chinese, where reading English is relatively less opaque versus the Tamil and English readers. For them, the Tamil language is more transparent and English is relatively more opaque. So when we had these participants, we had them actually go through some brain scans and did some functional MRI with them while they were reading words. I'll show you the method in a second, but basically we wanted to see firstly whether these bilinguals who read the different scripts of different orthographic depth would recruit differential functional representation for reading in their two scripts. So in other words, when they're reading, for example, in Chinese, would they use more of a lexical pathway? Would this part of the brain be more activated? When they were reading in English, then would their sublexical pathway, the dorsal pathway, be relatively more engaged? And then we would expect the opposite for the English and Tamil bilinguals, where they would activate relatively more strongly their dorsal pathway for reading Tamil, whereas reading English, they might actually be activating the ventral pathway, the more lexical pathway. And so both in terms of what's activated when they're reading either Tamil or Chinese was of interest, but also are there differences when they're reading English based on their other language? So in this study, I'll just show one of the slides, and this is done by a colleague, Joyce Wu, who's at in NIE now. And so the participants went through the scanner reading. It was actually a passive reading task, so they would read words, a set of words or pseudo words, and we also had other conditions to do some contrasts. And then every so often they would see a word that's a color that represents, like green would come up, so they had to tap a response key. So that was just to make sure that they were processing for meaning the words, that they're actually reading the words. So that was the setup of the study. And if we look at the whole brain scan, so this was for the Tamil English bilinguals on the left, so their left and their right hemisphere, and then for the Chinese English bilinguals on the right, so their left and their right hemisphere. And we can see that the overlapped areas are in purple for the Tamil speakers, and they're in this kind of, I guess that's a brown color for the Chinese English bilinguals. So we do see a bit of overlap, but also some unique areas that are related to either reading Tamil or reading Chinese. And this is comparing when they're reading words or when they're reading pseudo words. So overall, what we found with this study, one of the findings was that when reading a transparent script, such as Tamil, this tended to engage more of the dorsal stream areas that are related to sublexical processing as compared to when they were reading in English. And then the other group, that when they were reading in Chinese, this tended to recruit more lexicosemantic processing in the ventral stream, specifically in the frontal areas. And then when they were reading English, there was a difference, more of a bigger difference between reading non-words, which engaged more of the dorsal or parietal areas. So these were some interesting findings, and they go along with some earlier summaries in meta-analyses. This was done by Tan et al., and they found that there were neural systems for phonological processing for Chinese characters. It takes place in more frontal areas, whereas for reading alphabetic scripts, it takes place more in the traditional dorsal area around the temporal parietal areas. So there were, of course, some nuances to the findings, but overall it looked like there's a similar pattern where there are different areas of activation depending on which script the person was reading. Okay, so this takes us to the idea that depending on the script, there are different cognitive demands for reading, and this would suggest that the process of reading and learning to read might be different depending on the type of script that you're learning. So this is just a nice graphic that combines the orthographic depth hypothesis, where the script can be more or less transparent or opaque, in its relation to spoken language, and also considering the grain size at which a reader might optimally process the words. So we see from, for example, English is relatively less transparent than some of the other alphabetic languages like Italian and German. And we also have the language that we're studying in Singapore, Malay, is relatively also more transparent than English. And so these would be languages where processing would take place probably at the phoneme level. And then we have languages where you have Kana script or characters that can be processed at a syllable level. And I'll describe in a little more detail the Tamil script, but Tamil is described sometimes as an alpha syllabary. So this is also a script that can be processed at the syllable level. And then we have Chinese, in particular Mandarin Chinese is another one of the languages that we're studying in terms of reading development and spelling. And this is, again, can be primarily processed at the syllable or word level rather than at the phoneme level. So when we think about this in terms of going back to the lexical constituency model, where Perfetti's group suggested, that readers will be attracted to or have an affinity towards the relevant units that specify word identification best. In this case, if we look at their example for Chinese, we see that the mapping between the phonological system and the meaning system is a many to one. So there are many homophones or homophonic words in Chinese. But if you look at the orthographic system, it's less dense, right? So you can more accurately or more specifically specify the word meaning based on the character in many cases, as opposed to the spoken word form. So in this case, this suggests, that the relevant unit for Chinese, again, would be more at the meaning level and perhaps also at the whole word level. So again, this is suggestive that different sub-skills might be contributing more to reading or learning to read. And we see in several meta-analysis studies that can be true, that for alphabetic languages, the meta-analysis by Melvey-Lervog et al. Showed that phonological awareness was actually the strongest predictor of reading ability across alphabetic languages. And it was also the best predictor for discriminating children who have developmental dyslexia. In a more recent meta-analysis comparing English and Chinese reading, they found that although phonological awareness was again the stronger correlate of reading in English, morphological awareness across studies was found to be more strongly related to reading accuracy than phonological awareness was. So again, suggestive of different skill sets, perhaps, for different scripts. And so this is summarized nicely in Catherine McBride's book, where she states, the building blocks of reading may, therefore, comprise a variety of adjustments related to easy or early word recognition. Okay, so the only thing that we want to add here is, well, what about spelling? So now I'm just going to transition into some more background on spelling and theories of spelling, because there's been a lot of work on reading and reading development and more work on reading in different languages, but less so for spelling and how spelling develops. And so we can also ask, what are the cognitive demands for spelling across scripts? What information do spellers use in different languages? And so we can understand that spelling will involve these same types of representations. So we have print, we have sound, and we have meaning, and that depending on the script, the relationship between the print and the sound may be more or less closely related. And so this is the triangle model that we talked about before, and as related to the dual root model, where we can have links between orthography and phonology that then contribute to our understanding of semantics, so this indirect route, or a more direct route from the orthography to semantics. And so if we consider this type of model, the triangle model, in terms of spelling, we can use a similar representation, although the direction of the linkages are going to go in the opposite direction. So here we want to go from speech to print, so sounding out a word and printing it out, or just knowing or memorizing how it's spelled directly from its meaning. And so these sets of models that use this type of a framework originally started by Virginia Berninger and also from Barr and Daffern have been looking at this model, which is referred to as the triple word form theory or triple code theory. And so we've been using this more recently to look at children's spelling across different scripts, even though this particular model, again, was developed for alphabetic languages. So according to this triple code framework, Barr et al. Developed a scheme for categorizing spelling errors according to the different codes called the POMAS scheme. And Daffern et al. Developed actually an assessment called the COST, or the Components of Spelling Test. And even though both of these are using different types of data, so Barr et al.'s team looked at spellings from written narrative samples of children across different age groups, and Daffern's group developed a word dictation test with items that were selected for requiring specific features more related to phonological, orthographic, or morphological processing. So according to these schemes, the types of errors that would be considered phonological would be any spelling of a word that incorrectly represents the sounds. So this could include the use of an allophone, something that sounds similar, but it's not exactly the right sound. It could also be where the child might omit or add letters or phonological elements. And it could also include indicators of difference in stress or tone. On the other hand, orthographic errors would be errors where the phonology might be preserved, but it's preserved with incorrect or ambiguous letters. So this could be, words, if you sound them out, decode them, it sounds like a real word, but the spelling does not exist or doesn't represent a real word, otherwise known as pseudo-homophones. And then we have the morphological types of spelling errors would involve it could involve the correct representation of sound, but where it has a different meaning. So this would be more like a homophone, where you have two spellings of a word, of two different words that sound the same, but hold different meanings. So this is kind of the basic framework for these three types of errors. Of course, there are errors that combine these, so it's a little challenging to divide these up into specifically three types. But that's what we've been trying to do, at least initially, because it's just for simplification to deal with these three types. We also, can map these back to the triangle model, as well as some of the neuroscience findings. Okay, so now I'll just go through a couple of studies, an earlier study that we did where we applied this spelling error coding scheme to children who were asked to do a spelling task. And so this took place in Singapore, and this was working with a set of children in primary grade 1, so they're about 6 years old. And these children in Singapore, the curriculum in primary school and starting in preschool is that the mode of instruction is in English, but they're also formally learning what's referred to as a mother tongue, their ethnic language. So that can be one of three languages that they're assigned to learn, either Malay language, Tamil language, or Chinese language. And for this particular study, we used a word dictation task, and we selected some items from the children's school curriculum at primary grade 1. So I'll just go through some more specifics about these three scripts. The data that I'll present here is just looking at their writing in the Asian script, not in English. So the features of each of these scripts, just to contrast with English, is that the Malay script uses the same Roman alphabet, except X is not used in their alphabet. So they have 25 rather than 26 letters. As compared to English, the syllable units are less complex, whereas English has up to 6 types of different syllables. In Malay, the syllables tend to be shorter. However, there are a lot of affixes that are used, so it's considered a highly agglutinative language. There's also reduplication, where the same syllable is repeated. So that makes for some longer words, even if the syllable units are shorter. In terms of phonological representation, English is sometimes described as morphophonemic because some words, particularly some of the irregular words, might not be decodable because the meaning or the morphology of the word is preserved over the sound structure of the word, whereas Malay script predominantly has coding of phonemes before meaning. Both have multi-letter words. And English differs from Malay in terms of things like consonant clusters. There's less consonant clusters in Malay script. Sometimes there are vowel pairs that actually are either pronounced together, or if they're at a syllable boundary, can be pronounced separately. So that causes some complications for spellers. And then, of course, they have similar graphemic elements in terms of letters and letter strokes. So the other two scripts are quite different. And they're different in terms of, firstly, the orthographic inventory, or what Sonala has referred to as orthographic breadth. So Tamil script has 247 glyphs. Chinese has thousands, so they have a much larger inventory. In terms of the phonological units, Tamil, as I mentioned, is considered an alpha syllabic script. So each glyph is actually, most glyphs, I would say, are a syllable. So they include a consonant sound plus a vowel, but it follows alphabetic principles, whereas Chinese script would be described more as morphosyllabic. So the character unit preserves meaning. And so meaning is coded over phonology, whereas the opposite is true for Tamil. Phonemes are coded over meaning. And then for word forms, you can have multi-akshara words or multi-glyph words for Tamil, single to multi-character words for Chinese. And then in terms of subword forms, Tamil script also has things like diacriticals that will make the vowel sound different. And in Chinese, the characters will have, in many cases, components or radicals that represent semantic meaning, and the other represents phonetic meaning or phonetic representation. And then each of them has a set of strokes where Tamil script can be both curved and straight, but generally is linear, going from left to right. Chinese script has these more square units that can either have an orientation where you have a left and a right component, or they can be arranged top to bottom, or with this kind of surround around it. So that's just probably more details than you need to know, but just to give you a sense of how these written scripts look and the units that make up the script and what they represent. Okay, so for the study that we ran where we had children write the words in either Chinese or Malay or Tamil, we made some predictions based on previous work and the model of the POMIS model. So we would expect that for a transparent alphabetic language like Malay, they're going to be heavily using, for reading at least, this indirect pathway or sublexical pathway. And so they might be utilizing more phonological information, and therefore that would yield more phonological errors in their word spelling. For the Tamil script, we also suspected that they might have more phonological errors, since this is also an alphabetic script. And the phonological syllables follow a sound to print mapping pretty consistently. But we also expected that they might show more orthographic errors just based on the bigger orthographic breadth. That they have to learn many more graphemic units. And then on the other hand, for Chinese, we expected that the children would make more morphological and or orthographic errors because of the opaqueness of the relationship between the print and the phonology for Chinese, and that they would process words at a more lexical level. And so what we found in our study was that this is just representing the majority of errors that each group was making. So for Malay and for Tamil, we did find that most of the errors were involving phonological aspects of, either missing or substituted parts of the word. For Malay, these substitutions or omissions were mainly involving vowels, whereas for Tamil, these mainly involved consonant substitutions. For Chinese, we found that although there were more morphemic errors, including things like homophone substitutions, than there were phonological errors, the bulk of their errors was really that they were writing the wrong character overall. So it might be at this young age, they still didn't have enough inventory or enough knowledge about all of the different characters for the words that we were trying to get them to write. Okay, so overall, the results from this first study was showing that phonological errors there were more phonological errors made in Malay script as compared to Tamil, and the least for Chinese. Malay script, again, mainly had issues with representing vowel sounds. For morphological errors, it was in the order of Chinese script yielded more morphological errors as compared to Malay, and then Tamil had the least. Actually, there were pretty much zero types of morphological errors for Tamil. And then the orthographic or graphemic errors, Malay was actually showing more of these types of errors as compared to Chinese or Tamil. In Chinese, the children, were okay with how the character was supposed to be configured. So sometimes you might think that they would flip the left and the right components, but they actually showed little of those types of errors. It was more that they just weren't aware of how to form the overall character. Okay, so this this was an interesting first study for us, and but we did have some limitations in that we tried to use items that the children might know, so the words that they might be learning to spell in school, to make it more ecologically valid. But this meant that we had an uneven number of, or uneven opportunities for some of the different error codes. So in some languages, there were less morphological types of errors that the children could make. It was also a dictation task, and it required the children to write out the whole word. So many of them would leave a blank if they didn't know the whole word, instead of representing any part of it. It was also a cross-sectional study. So here we were just looking at the primary one children. And then we also, in this case, did not look at their English spelling within the triple code framework. So with those limitations in mind, we have an ongoing study now where we're using a similar framework to code children's spelling errors. And in this case, we have 3 age cohorts. So we have a group of kindergartners, about almost 5 years old, first grade children who are between 6 and 7, and then third grade children who are 8 to 9 years old. And we do have roughly this number of bilingual Malay and English, Tamil English, Chinese and English, but for today, we're still working on the Chinese and English coding, and we're finalizing some of the Malay and Tamil error coding as well, but I'll just present the English and Malay and English and Tamil data that we have so far. So we also modified the task that we use. So instead of using a dictation task, which also really elicits, having an oral spoken language, you have to translate from speech to print. But when you're writing, when you're using expressive language, you don't have somebody telling you the word, you have to come up with the word yourself. So you have kind of your inner voice rather than hearing the auditory dictated word. So to try to get to more of a naturalistic type of writing process like that, we used a spelling test where there is a closed procedure. So in this case, the child would see the word with some blanks, and then they would have to fill in the blanks with either the missing letter or akshara or characters. And so this is based on that cost model from Daffern et al. So in this case, they had to look for what the word should be. We gave them cues in terms of a picture to aid the identification of the word. And for the kindergarten students, they also heard an audio of the word being played. So these are some examples to show the items. And so as you can see, there's the picture with the missing components, so the child should understand what the word should be corresponding to the picture and therefore fill in the missing letters. We did have different items for each age group so that they could more easily do this task. So for example, the younger children, we had more simple CVC or simple morphemes at kindergarten, whereas we had more complex types of words as they got older. And then we used a similar number of items for eliciting each type of knowledge. So we had like for the, I think Malay and Tamil groups, for kindergarten, we had 10 items for phonological knowledge, 10 for orthographic knowledge, and 10 for morphological knowledge. And then for the older kids, we had 14 of each set. So this way we tried to give more equal opportunities for children to show us what they knew about spelling with regard to either orthographic, phonological, or morphological features of the language. And so this is just an example of some of the features. So again, this is following from the type of task that Daffern et al. Had constructed. And so here for English, we have some specific features that we're looking at in terms of sound structure. So whether it's initial or final consonants, different types of vowels, consonant blends. We also had some items which show in spoken English in Singapore some vowel mergers, so there might be some confusion from their experience with speech of those words in terms of how they should be represented phonologically. Then we had orthographic features, so irregular words, and many of these came from other sources. So we gathered from different studies on spelling in English to come up with and compile this list. And then for morphological features, we had words that were missing their inflectional or derivational suffix, or that would have a homophone that might be confusable in terms of having the same sound but being spelled differently. Also some difference in the types of roots that were presented. So we did similar sets of features for each of the languages. So I'll just show them briefly here. I can go back to these if you want to, but again, the idea was to have words with missing parts that would require the child to fill them in based on either their phonological, orthographic, or morphological knowledge. Just going to take a drink while you look at the constructs for Tamil. Okay, and many of our research team are involved in the development and piloting of these tasks too. And hopefully you can see their faces, or I'll show you their picture later. Okay, so we also have Chinese, but as mentioned, we developed the Chinese items with constructs in mind. But I think the way that we're scoring them might be different. We will be scoring them a little bit differently than the other languages. That's why it's still underway. Okay, so from this, for this study, we also had similar predictions with regard to script differences. So we would expect the transparent alphabetic scripts to yield more phonological errors, the non-alphabetic scripts and the opaque scripts to show perhaps more morphological errors. Alternatively, we thought that maybe since these children are learning to read and write in two languages at the same time, and one of those is English, they might be sharing strategies for reading or writing across their languages that they're learning. And if that's true, then we would expect to see some probably some differences according to the typological difference or distance of their script sets. So, for example, Malay language would more closely reflect English error types, while Chinese would deviate more from English with in terms of morphological errors. The other thing we wanted to examine, and we're still analyzing some of this, but just have some preliminary data. The other question is, do we see the same pattern of errors across the age groups and then within each language across the age groups? So in other words, some models of reading development, such as Bear and colleagues, have suggested that children go through phases, spelling phases. And the first phase, at least for English and alphabetic languages, is that they develop an understanding of how uh, the sound structure of words and how those sounds are represented in the word. Then the next phase would be that they start to learn about orthographic patterns, so spelling patterns and chunking larger units together as spelling units. And then finally, when they get into the third phase, they would more directly understand the morphological structure of words and how that affects spelling. So that was another question that we wanted to ask with this group was, first of all, do the children look like they're going through, or do children in the different age groups have different error patterns based on what this developmental sequence is expected to show? And if so, do we see the same differences reflecting these developmental phases across different languages? So this is another question that we don't have an answer to yet, but hopefully we will get there. So again, just to note, this study is underway, and we just have preliminary results so far. And this again is just for the children learning Malayan English and Tamil and English. So ML is Malay language, TL is Tamil language, and this graph is just showing the overall number of errors or percent of errors across the items across all the items that the children had. So kindergarten, we see many errors. Grade 1, they start to get better at spelling, and by grade 3, they're doing okay. They're doing pretty good. And so we also see that for English, these are errors. So the higher the error rate, the worse the performance. So we can also see that in most cases, the children are poorer at their non-English language, and that's because there's more dominance in English in Singapore, and also the curriculum focuses most of the day on English and less of the day on what's referred to as the mother tongue language. So English is the blue bars, and the other language, whether it's Malay or Tamil, are the green bars. So we see some similarities also in terms of the two groups, in terms of their overall error rates. So then the next thing I'll show are some charts, some pie graphs that show us the percentage of these errors that each child performed, what percentage of their errors would fall into our phonological type of error, our morphological type of error, or our orthographic type of error. So I'm just going to focus on English first. So these are the colors for phonological is blue, morphological orange, orthographic is green, and these are the age groups. So this is for kindergarten children, primary 1 children, and primary 3 children. And the ones on the left are the English Malay bilingual children's English scores, and then the ones on the right are the English Tamil children's, also their English spelling. So here what we found was that for English, both of these languages look very similar. So, I think what we can say is probably here not an effect of typological distance between the two languages that the child's learning. In this case, for all age groups, we found that we found that for kindergarten, the children made relatively less phonological errors than the other two types. The same for Malay and Tamil. And then at primary one, they actually were making more phonological errors than the other two error types. It's the same thing for both the Malay group and the Tamil group. And then by the time they get to primary three, or children who are currently in primary three, this is a cross-sectional study. The children in primary three showed the least number or the least percentage of phonological errors for their English spelling as compared to morphological and orthographic errors, which are the same for each of these plots. The M errors, morphological errors, and the O errors, orthographic errors, are statistically the same. So our first question about whether there's maybe some difference in terms of the other language affecting children's English performance, we don't think we see that here. Okay, so now I'm showing you for the same set of kids, their spelling error types for their other language. So for Malay here, and the kids who spelled in Tamil over here. So for the Malay spellings, the children across all the age groups showed a consistent pattern. And this pattern was one where there were more orthographic errors actually as compared to phonological errors. And then their morphological errors were fewest for Malay language. When we looked at the Tamil language, there were differences across the age groups. So here for the kindergartners, they made similar number of morphological and orthographic errors, and they made more morphological than phonological errors. When we get to the primary one children, there's differences in all three types. So in this case, again, their phonological errors are most frequent, and then morphological second most frequent, and then orthographic least frequent. And then for the third grade group, their phonological and orthographic errors were at the same rate, whereas their morphological errors were greater than these two types. We also looked at okay, I'm going to the other part. So overall, the differences between our scripts, we find that Malay and Tamil are each relatively transparent scripts, and they can code oral language at different grain sizes. So this resulted perhaps in differences across the spelling error patterns for these two languages. So phonological errors, however, were not the most common for Malay, which is what we originally predicted and based on our previous study. Instead, they made more orthographic errors. But phonological errors were just as common as orthographic errors for spelling in Tamil language. Also, morphological errors played the least important role for Malay and played a stronger role for Tamil in this case. So as far as their cross-linguistic strategies mentioned, both of the language groups showed similar spelling error type patterns for English words. So this again indicated that this was outside of the regard of typological distance between their script sets. The second thing that
yep, probably want to be wrapping up in 2 or 3 minutes, if that's all right.
Oh,
5
sure, no
minutes,
problem.
is that okay? Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so I'll just go quickly through the rest where we looked at age group differences. So across the grades, phonology played a more important role. When the children are at primary level 1, or children who are just entering primary school, which is interesting because this is when they really get their direct instruction in reading and writing, or when they first get direct instruction. For Malay, the pattern persisted over the grade levels, though. And then, so from this, we see that the changes in their spelling development wasn't really following what we predicted according to the developmental phase models. It wasn't showing this universal progression through the phases that have been described in the literature. But they instead might be more affected by the nature of their scripts, the cognitive demands of spelling in that script, and then strategies that the spellers adopted to meet the demands. So this would have, incorporated the ideas of the interdependence hypothesis, that there's common underlying proficiency for, in this case, literacy, or the linguistic and orthographic proximity hypothesis, where the overlap or the proximity between languages is based on also the orthographic structure. So we didn't see that affecting languages. There's also some cross-language indications for spelling with regard to the forms of the print. So Treeman and colleagues have suggested that there are inner forms of print and outer forms of print. So the outer forms of print would be more the visual characteristics. In an earlier study, we found that these outer forms of print might be more related. So learning about how to write in Chinese and write in English early on shows a higher correlation, whereas later on, children show a divergence between writing in English and writing in the other script, because at that point, the purpose of writing is to represent language with these different codes. Okay, I was just going to go through some maybe quick cross-language effects just to show when we look at the proportion of errors for children's English and their other language spelling, we see that there are some moderate but significant relationships across the error types, and that this also showed some changes over the age groups. So in conclusion, the children learning to read and write in more than one language, they have to meet this challenge of how each language specifies the oral language. While some of the previous studies in biliteracy suggest that children will transfer their knowledge across languages, we don't know as much about how they do this spontaneously, or whether it's how to train them to do this when they're learning to read and write in multiple languages. But one thing would be to identify these universal versus language-specific components of the learning process can help children as well as their teachers, so that they can leverage on how to transfer their knowledge from reading and writing in one script to the other. And then I had just some ideas for implications, but we can skip these because they're just a bit speculative. But maybe if we have other questions for discussion, I just want to thank everyone for their attention. Thanks to our sponsors for 2 of the projects that we've been working on. And here's some of our team members from NIE that have been very dedicated to this project. Okay, so I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Beth.